Hey VC, let's talk about the blues. Let's talk about John Lee Hooker. I got into the blues probably late high school, early university. Uncle Mike, if you're watching this, I believe I still have that cassette tape that you made me. My uncle made me this mixtape, had all kinds of great blues artists on it. Robert Johnson, I think Sonny Boy Williamson was on there. I don't know that John Lee Hooker was on there. And it was only once I started collecting records that I started diving into John Lee Hooker. I have no idea why. Now that I've started, I can't stop, and there's at least 3 or 4 albums that I'm going to claim I need to own by Hooker. Um, in any event, I thought I would just showcase the few that I do have and tell you a little bit about the guy. This is by no means a full explanation of who he is, where he's been, and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, if you're interested in the blues a little bit, this might get you started down a road, or at least get you to understand and appreciate John Lee Hooker as an artist. Um, yeah, so we'll jump right in here. You know what's great about these old blues guys, and it's not just John Lee Hooker, there's a bunch of them. And it's not really a good thing, it's more of a reflection of the times when they were born, is that these guys have varying dates of birth. So how old they are, we never really truly know, right? So in the different sources I was looking at and prepping for this and learning about John, 1917, 1918, 1920, 1922, 1928 were all cited in various places as a potential year of birth. He died in 2001 in California, we know that. And at that time, he would have been somewhere in his mid to late 80s, depending on your birth date you choose. Born near, and again, the birthplace, somewhere near Clarksdale, Mississippi is what the consensus seems to be. Another interesting thing, we don't really know how many brothers and sisters he had. I thought I was solid in saying, oh, he was the youngest of 11, and then I read something else that said, no, he was the fourth child of so-and-so. So lots of debate on the very beginnings of John Lee Hooker. There's a few key dates that kind of stay the same across your sources, and that's cool, but I guess it kind of adds to the whole mystique a bit about who these guys were, where they came from. But ultimately, this guy obviously had brothers and sisters. His parents separated at some point. The stepfather figure that comes in was actually a blues musician, and so he was the one that was the major influence, if not the sole influence, on John Lee Hooker's playing from an early age. He started playing at about 13 or 14, again, two different sources, two different things, but there was a really cool quote that I wrote down, and that was cited in two different places. It said, so Hooker says, "My grandfather taught me to pick out harmony on strips of inner tube nailed at different tensions on a barn door." I'm like, holy shit, how is that not the coolest like blues guy fact ever, right? So really great origin story there. He leaves home at like age 14. Some sources says he went to Detroit first, then came back because that didn't work out. But then a lot of people say he went to Memphis, then he went to Cincinnati. All the while, he's just working these Joe jobs to try to get enough money to continue to just pursue music as a career, right? And every stop along the way, of course, he's learning different styles, right? Different regions of the States, he would pick up a new style. And at the end of the day, you know, he makes it his own. He has a very unique sound. If you don't know John Lee Hooker, you know, a few of these songs I might mention will just give you everything you need to know about what that style is, right? So ultimately, he started out like a lot of them on early gospel music and then ventured more into the blues. So he's traveling around, he's picking up styles, and ultimately he arrives in Detroit, they say, at about 1943. And then he starts, I think one source said he was starting to work at like the Ford Motor Company in a plant somewhere. Anyway, the point is the guy is just trying to get money in his pocket so that he can do what he loves, which is play music and you know, become a star, I guess. So he gets there in Detroit in 43. First time he's recorded is 1948, and a label out of Los Angeles ends up publishing it. Like, he's got something down to wax, the B side of which was Boogie Chillin', which is kind of one of his most famous tunes. And that the B side on that first single that was cut ended up being more popular than the actual song, the first track itself. So yeah, 1948, he puts that out, Boogie Chillin'. He was invited to play at the inaugural Newport Folk Festival, which I thought was pretty cool. So he was there with Sonny Terry and Brownie McGhee. He was there with Reverend Gary Davis, two other iconic blues guys, or two guys and another guy. So pretty cool that he was there. I think he made subsequent appearances as well, perhaps, but to be at the first one, that's pretty slick. He worked for a lot of different labels, so everything you're reading about the guy it seems as though he would travel from one label to another, and every time he'd do that, probably to just to sort of cover his ass, he would slightly change his name. So he had all these pseudonyms like Birmingham Sand, Johnny Williams, the Boogie Man, that's an obvious one, John Lee Booker, Little Pork Chops, John Lee Cooker, Delta John, Texas Slim. So a lot of great names, and all just for the reasons of kind of bouncing around different labels, just trying to make a buck, right? So some of the, I think one of his earliest labels was VJ Records. He played on Chex. That first thing that came out was on Modern Records. Anyway, so just bouncing all over the place, just trying to make a buck, just trying to make it in the business. So super cool stuff. So his style, what is his style described as? I was going to try to freewheel this, but there's some wicked quotes out there that kind of sum it all up. So his style's been described as, quote, a driving rhythmic boogie style. He is, quote, forceful with impassioned anguish. The voice is immediately arresting, a deep, dark, leather-timbered instrument that turns sullen, nostalgic, brooding, or sensuous. And many recording sessions spoke of a similar setup, which was he comes in with his guitar, comes in with his bottle of scotch, and then they put down a piece of plywood on the floor, because that was his sound, right? If you didn't know that, John Lee Hooker would play his guitar and he would stomp his foot on a piece of plywood, and that would, you know, every time you hear a track of his, you can hear that in the background, right? Depending on how much they mic'd it up, you could hear it. Super cool. He was difficult to work with, not because of his personality, but mainly because his timing was all over the place. Like he would just switch stuff up on occasion or just do what he felt like doing. And so whatever band came in with him, whether it was session musicians or someone that, you know, he chose to play with from other groups, it was a challenge. And so kind of another thing that just adds to the cool factor of it all, right? The guy just couldn't keep up with the guy. Blues Hall of Fame in 1980, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1990. I think I have those dates right. And, you know, I could go down a huge list of all the people that kind of credit him as an inspiration, but the ones that come to mind are the Yardbirds, Canned Heat, which we'll talk about, the Animals, and Buddy Guy. So that's kind of my little Coles Notes primer on who the guy is. You know, from Mississippi to the big city, starts playing his blues, starts to catch on, starts working with other musicians, and ultimately makes it big and lives a hell of a long time to us, like I said, mid or late 80s. Okay, so what do I have by John Lee Hooker? So I don't have his first album by any means, but what I do have is something that kind of throws him back to his roots. So this is The Country Blues of John Lee Hooker. This is a 2019 Kraft reissue. Kevin Gray was on this one. Sounds fantastic. This is just him and acoustic guitar. That's it. Like, there's no other backing band. It's just him and an acoustic. And I'm a fan. I'm all in on any time someone does that. Any musician that just says, you know what, I'll do an album with just me and my guitar. And then you really get a sense for what that person's capable of, right? So this was 1960 on Riverside Records, so another label. Riverside Records, this was recorded in 1959. I'm gathering this is like his third official release, but it's really hard to kind of keep track of all that kind of stuff. But again, just Hooker and the guitar, great stuff. Then I just picked this up recently. This was from 1962, and this is on VJ, so another label that he was part of. And this, I would say, is probably his 10th album, if I'm calculating that right. This was recorded in 61 in Chicago. This has the big hit Boom Boom on it. So that's another classic John Lee Hooker song, Boom Boom. It was made famous, or more famous, I guess, when the Animals covered it. So the Animals, being a wicked, you know, British blues kind of band, they chose that as one of the singles off their first album. So I think that kind of speaks to the admiration level that they had for Hooker. Super warm album. Like, there's two saxophones playing on this, and they're not really in the forefront, so if you're not a fan of like a saxophone kind of sound, you're not going to get that. You're just going to get this background warmth to the whole album that just kind of carries it through. Beautiful stuff. Again, so this is a 2023 reissue by Kraft again, and Kevin Gray, once again, original analog tapes, if that's something you care about. The first major Hooker album that I bought, like I found one that was in a yard sale that's kind of beat the shit here, but the first really special one I bought was when I first got into collecting, and I first found out about acoustic sounds, analog productions, and I had to grab this. Just the way people were talking about the sound in this album. I was getting into John Lee Hooker. I wanted the best sound possible. This album does not disappoint. So this was 2010, I think they put this out, and this is a repress in 2021, Analog Productions. This is the 45 RPM one. Again, Kevin Gray, I guess he likes John Lee Hooker, or at least gets hired to do a lot of his stuff, and pressed at QRP. So like one of my higher end pressings if you want to go down that road. But ultimately, this is on Impulse, which, if you know anything about Impulse, it's mainly a jazz label. They tried to venture off and kind of incorporate some folk related stuff, maybe a blues title here and there. But ultimately, it's the only thing on Impulse that I have at this point, I think. So it's a jazz label, and as such, when they created the sessions for this, they actually brought in jazz musicians to back them up. Doesn't sound jazzy. Like, it's if you're afraid of that sound, whatever, this album is still great to go to. In fact, it's my favorite one I probably own by him. Simply for that first track, Shake It Baby. I cannot get enough of that. Listen to that if you're interested in the blues, if you're interested in John Lee Hooker. Shake It Baby off this album, It Serves You Right to Suffer, is just amazing. And this was recorded in New York, and from what I can tell, possibly like the 20th, 21st release, if we want to try to keep track of that. Okay, and then another big one comes in. So Hooker, he arrives in Detroit in late 40s, starts putting music out in the 50s, kind of quiets down for him a little bit, and then he's still making music though. And then he starts to hook up with other musicians. People admire him, they like him, plus he wants to get a little bit of an elevated appearance. So what does he do? He partners with Canned Heat. This album, Hooker and Heat, put him in the charts. This was a huge thing for him, and I'm sure for Canned Heat as well. In fact, on Discogs, this is actually labeled as a Canned Heat title, not a John Lee Hooker title, but other places have the reverse being true. Anyway, it's a collaboration between the two of them. This is an absolutely incredible album. In fact, I would probably suggest this album more than any other. If you really wanted a John Lee Hooker album, get Hooker and Heat. This is a reissue, 2009 Pure Pleasure Records, and this is a repress from 2020. Absolutely incredible stuff, cut from the analog tapes, the whole works. Sounds phenomenal, right? And this is like, recorded live in the studio. You can hear banter between everyone in between tracks. But ultimately, this is 1971. This was recorded on Liberty, so another label. Recorded in 1970, released in 1971, and that's important. I'll tell you in a second. So this is the first of his albums to chart. Some tracks are just Hooker all by himself. Some tracks are just Hooker with Alan Wilson, and some tracks are with all of Canned Heat, or almost all of Canned Heat. But ultimately, recorded in 1970. What month was it? I thought I wrote it down here. May 1970. September 1970, Alan Wilson dies. So Alan Wilson was the harmonica player, guitarist for Canned Heat, and he was phenomenal at his instrument. He was really good at it. And the best part on this album is in between a couple tracks when John Lee Hooker stops and presumably he looks at Alan Wilson and he says, compliments him and says, "I don't know how that boy can keep up with me." So pretty cool, praise from John Lee Hooker that you're that good that you can, hold your own with him. So Alan Wilson ended up dying of an overdose in September of that year. So he actually wasn't around when the album got released. And on the album cover, when they shot the photo for it, Alan being deceased, you probably may be able to see this through there, but there's actually a photo on the wall of Alan Wilson there, kind of commemorating that. But Hooker and Heat, outstanding album. First track, Messing with the Hook. I can't seem to not play that every time that album goes on. Okay, first album I ever owned by John Lee Hooker. Not a popular album, and in fact, some of the critics didn't like it at the time. I like it, but what do I know, right? Endless Boogie, John Lee Hooker. So, also recorded in 1971, and another example of him working with other musicians. There's a lot of different names on this. The only two that I can really recognize are Steve Miller's on this and Mark Naftalin's on this. Mark was the piano player in the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and of course you know who Steve Miller is probably. So this is recorded in San Francisco. This is with ABC. Hey, another label, who would have thought? And Pots On, Gas on High, awesome song. Endless Boogie, awesome song. Just another great album. This is quite beat up, but it was like $10, $15 at the time, so I picked it up, no regrets at all. Endless Boogie, John Lee Hooker. And then when I had heard about all the fuss about him collaborating with Canned Heat, and I knew there was an album called Hooker and Heat, I came across this one before I had the other one. I'm like, oh God, I found it in the wild. This is great. I never thought I'd ever get a copy of this, called Hooker and Heat. So it's not a bad album, but it is not the actual Hooker and Heat album. This is actually a live recording from 1981. Of course, Alan Wilson's already gone. This is a Canadian pressing. canned heat album. Only 3 of the 9 tracks feature John Lee Hooker, so it's really a canned heat album, not a John Lee Hooker album. But what the hell, I'm going to show it anyway because it's John Lee Hooker and that's what we're talking about. So that's about it. So what do you need to know about the guy? You need to know he's a great musician. You need to know that he's got a very impressive and distinct style in a time when a lot of guys were going from the Mississippi South area and working towards the cities. They were, gathering their style and bringing it there, and everything starts going electric for blues. It's important to realize that how hard it would be to kind of maintain a distinct sound, and I think John Lee Hooker nailed it. Am I leaving stuff out? For sure I am. Do I know everything about John Lee Hooker? Hell no. But I'm learning and I love it, and this guy just can't seem to do no wrong at this point. So anyway, when you got your John Lee Hooker, spin it often, spin it loud. Thanks for sticking this one out. See you in the next one.